Hello and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the ways in which they enable and impact human flourishing, and the people and ideas that make them possible. I'm Angelica Walker-Worth, and this is my husband Thomas, and he's going to introduce our topic for today.
Yeah, so, a lot of the things we cover on this show all really depend on the same thing. In fact, pretty much everything we cover on this show depends on the same thing, and that's power. And that doesn't just mean electrical power, but really anything we talk about nowadays, medical advancements, research, all that kind of stuff depends on electricity. And even when we go back into the past, steam power, water power, everything that human beings achieve pretty much depends on some form of harnessing energy. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. So we really wanted to explore around all the different forms of energy production that exist and do a bit of a compare and contrast, but also study let's look at some recent developments in that as well, but also study the question of what's best and what kind of balance is right. And I just sort of wanted to briefly start by saying that that's a more complicated question than people often give it credit for, because we like to talk about renewable versus non-renewable fossil fuel energy sources, and then there's this term alternative, which is basically used to refer to nuclear power, as in something that's not renewable but not fossil fuel either. Which I have a whole problem with the concept of renewable, which I can get into. But is there anything you wanted to jump in with before I go there?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more just about the fact that power generation or power consumption and wealth tend to go hand in hand. You see a really strong positive correlation between wealth and energy consumption if you look at it on a country by country basis. And so I think some people get confused with the idea of we need to use less energy, and that's really not the goal, or shouldn't be the goal if our goal is human flourishing. We should be happy to use more energy, but we should be looking at that should be on an overall meta level that we're using more energy. We want to be using more energy because we're doing more things, not doing, using more energy to do the same things. And not only that, but as you were saying, power contributes to all these things, medical research and everything else that we talk a lot about on our show. But there are also uses for power that we haven't really tapped into yet, or have just started to tap into. So a couple of those would be things like mining for trace elements from the air or the ocean floor. Some people are looking into this, but at the moment it takes too much energy to feasibly do. Yeah. But if we had cheaper, more abundant energy, we could be doing these kinds of things. And another one that somebody has actually just started, I was just reading an article about it this morning, is making food without actually growing.
So basically,
anything.
A Star Trek replicator. Yeah.
I don't know if Star Trek was the thing, but it's a protein powder called solein, Solein, and they use carbon capture to get CO2 from the air. They combine it with water and a few nutrients, and this takes electricity. They're currently using solar power, but any electricity would be fine. And they actually got the idea from NASA, but this is a private company that has taken this idea and run with it, basically. Right. And they've launched their company this year. They've been in planning since 2018. They launched their company this year. I think it's called Solar Foods. And they intend to be at their full level of production. They have a numerical goal for how much they'll be producing by 2023.
Cool.
So this would be a way to make more of the meat alternative type foods that you and I eat a lot as vegetarians. Right now they've got a lot of plant-based burgers, but things like that. So it's a protein powder that would be used the same way that certain kind of plant-based replacements for meat are currently used for chicken nuggets or burgers or things like that.
Yeah.
So that's the idea behind it. So the point is, not only is energy use key to a lot of the innovations we've had thus far, they're also going to, in the future, there's so many more places we could go with cheap and abundant energy, so that's why it's important.
Yeah, I think what you sort of hinted at the start there is that efficiency is somewhat misunderstood as a term, when it applies to power. Like, really what efficiency means is how much power can you get from as little an investment as possible. Mm-hmm. That doesn't just mean financial investment, but what's the best ratio of energy and resources input to gain for human activity. And so the more power you can get out, the better. And the less you have to put in to do that, the better, because the more you can then create.
And so one of the measurements of that, one of the metrics is what's referred to as energy density,
Right.
which doesn't actually apply to all of the forms of energy because it's about how much energy you can get per unit of fuel. But just for reference, for comparison, coal gives you about 16 megajoules, which is a measurement of energy. For reference, Americans typically use 740 megajoules of energy. Each individual American uses 740 megajoules of energy in an average week.
Right.
So coal, you only get 16 of those megajoules per kilogram. Natural gas, we shoot way up to 55 megajoules per kilogram. Hydrogen, you get 120 megajoules per kilogram. Uranium-235, you get 3.9 megajoules per kilogram.
Right, but obviously the issue there is it's not just per weight of material, it's how much does it cost you to extract that material, to build a plant, to run off that material. So obviously with nuclear power, there's the expense of building this more complicated technology than there is with a basic coal-powered power station. Natural gas may be harder or easier to extract than coal is. So it's a more complicated equation than just the energy density of the material.
It's actually similarly complicated as I understand it because natural gas and coal are often found in the same place.
Sure.
So.
But yeah, because they both come from hydrocarbons from extinct animals, but the or plant life. But the point is it's not just a straightforward matter of the energy density of the material. It's a whole calculation of the efficiency net for human beings of using that as a power source versus the amount of power you get.
Certainly. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind with this is something that occurred to me when you're comparing coal and natural gas is what do we have to do in terms of safety, whether that's to adjust for really dangerous pollutants, or in the case of nuclear, there are all kinds of scenarios that we have to design for that add into that cost that you're talking about. And so, for example, natural gas doesn't give off as many pollutants as burning coal does, burning natural gas, that is. But with certain additional processes, you can actually clean the few pollutants it does give off when you're burning it.
Yeah.
But that's additional infrastructure you have to build to be able to do that.
And that kind of brings around to two issues we want to talk about. One is pollution, and like the most important way in which pollution is a factor is the fact that it can cause harm to human health. So if people who remember the London smogs of the 1950s, or anyone who lives in Los Angeles or Shanghai or any of the cities in the world that struggle a lot with smogs, knows that pollution does have a really serious effect on human health. And if a process puts out something into the atmosphere that actively harms other human beings, that's a violation of those other people's rights. It's become something of a question of degree as to when that is and isn't acceptable, because pollution is a necessary fundamental part of human existence, not just of human existence, really of life's existence. There is no such thing as impact-free life. Like, all life impacts the earth. Human life necessarily impacts the earth. If we want to live as human beings, we have to impact the earth. And that necessarily means impacting each other to some degree. It's, when does that make a measurable, clear, definite impact on other people's right to live freely? And pollution very much has done that at times in the past. When the river through Cleveland is catching fire because it's got so many pollutants in it, or people are dying because there's a smog, it's a different thing from a small trace amount of gas in the air that doesn't really impact anything.
Sure, and that's coal is really the good example of that. That's sort of poster child, because so many of the things that it emits when you burn it are directly harmful to human health, and immediately.
Yeah, it's the same with fuels in cars as well. Things like leaded gasoline, petrol as we call it here, or sulfur and diesel. Those things can actually have serious effects. And so you have to try and move past that and get to something that doesn't harm human health. The environmental division of pollution is a more complicated issue, because then you have to get into the science of to what extent does it impact climate change, and to what extent does that affect human life?
Which is much more complicated.
Yeah. The moral point there is that changing the environment in of itself is morally neutral. Like, the environment doesn't have moral value in of itself. Its value is in how we use it and how we live in it, which includes being able to enjoy its beauty as well as being able to physically survive from it. But that's where its moral value comes from. It's not, we need to get away from the idea that impact is bad and we should be seeking to reduce impact. It's, what impact are we having and how does that affect our ability to flourish on this planet?
Yeah, and if you're really concerned about ecosystems and the balance of them, I would encourage you to study some ecology, which is really quite complicated. But the basic point that I want to draw out from the ecology class that I did take is that impacts do change an ecosystem, but not all changes are bad, and not it's just not always destructive. Even non-native species, for example, which are getting a lot of hate right now, aren't always destructive. That's way off topic, so I'm not going to go any further down that road. But just the point is, change isn't always bad.
Yeah, and likewise,
even for an ecosystem,
life always causes change. And if you study paleontology, as I've done a bit, then as a geology student, then again, like life changes the environment throughout geological history. We're a species who thinks and does more as a result of that, but still the expansion of a species into an area has changed climate before. That's not a new thing. So we wouldn't have an oxygen-rich atmosphere to breathe now if plant life hadn't changed it originally. Right. That is how planets evolve. That kind of segues into the point I wanted to make about renewability as well.
Sure, go for it.
Which is that if you think on geological timescales, which you kind of have to, because we talk about how many 100 years of coal or oil or gas is left. Apart from the fact that those are almost always dramatic underestimates, because there's always more that you've not found, pretty much. But we tend to speak in those terms, and then we say, okay, so we've got those are the fossil fuels, the finite resources. Yeah, and then we have the alternative sources they're referred to, nuclear power, which is almost infinite, but because there's so much of it.
Yeah.
But there is technically a limited amount. And so they treat that as a different thing from renewables, which is this term that supposedly refers to things that will last forever: wind power, solar power, hydropower. The thing is, we don't live on a planet that's going to last forever. No. Billions of years into the future, there won't be an Earth anymore. And although obviously, it's as good as, I can appreciate we're not worrying about what's going to be the situation in several billion years. The point is that that's part of the natural evolution of a planet, that it ends over time. But the point is that uranium is going to be around so far into the future that using it really has no impact on our ability to continue using it as a power source,
and
to the extent that it's comparable to the fact that the sun's going to be around long enough for us to keep using solar power and wind power, but at some point they won't be. And it's a meaningless distinction, really, because there will still be uranium elsewhere in the solar system that we might be able to extract in the future. You can synthesize fuels.
Well, and it's not just uranium that we're using, but
no.
I think some people get hung up on this idea of we need to limit the types of power sources. We currently have many power sources that are on a global scale that provide us with power, and we probably will for a long time.
Yeah.
Probably forever. For as long as there are humans, we will have a mixture of power sources. And so the goal is just to have a mixture that is cheap and abundant and doesn't cause too many other negative externalities to other people.
Yeah, those are really the same thing. It's things that enhance human flourishing and don't reduce human flourishing.
Right.
So, it's something you can't really say that, a power source is enhancing human flourishing if it's killing people by the thousand.
Indeed.
But likewise, if it's sitting there not killing anyone except for birds that it swats out of the sky, like wind turbines tend to, but it's not giving anyone useful power either, then it's also not really contributing to human flourishing. And so I wanted to move on to the issue of reliability, which I think is way more important than renewability.
Yeah, so thank you, because that's one of the things I wanted to move into in this kind of middle section of the podcast. I wanted to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of different power types, and reliability is definitely a key one.
Well, I think it's, as I've sort of just explained, why renewability isn't terribly important, I don't think. And the thing is, renewability gets package dealed in with green, which are really two completely different issues as to whether you can keep using a power source and whether it's good for the environment or not. But reliability is a really more important measure in terms of whether or not it's functioning in its function as being a power source. And this is a problem that we've had in the UK in the past few weeks, because we've actually had a massive period of reduced wind in the UK in the past few weeks, and we were in a situation where wind power is supposed to be meeting I think it's 15% of demand, so I forget the exact figure, but it dropped down to 6%, and that meant that natural gas had to contribute 55% of the UK's power requirement. Historically, coal was meeting a lot more, but because coal's been cut down to 2%, natural gas has had to be meeting more of the difference than it was before. we're in a situation where we get all of our natural gas from Russia. We have to pay for it to import it. The Russians aren't exactly, cheap with that. So we've ended up with gas prices trebling in this country in the space of a year, which is, elderly people trying to heat their homes with gas. People who are, poor people, all of the people who need power and benefit from power the most, the poorest in society, the weakest in society are the ones taking the hit for that. And that's entirely because we're over-depending, well, not entirely, it's because we're over-depending on so-called renewables and on imported power.
Right.
We're not generating power locally like we easily could be, and then we're shutting down our ability to do that, and that's actually having real consequences for real human beings.
Yeah. So in terms of reliability, that just highlights that's basically solar and wind's biggest weakness, is that they're not reliable. We could talk about solar at the moment isn't really cost effective, would be the right way to put it, I think, for most people.
Yeah, it depends on the kind of solar. There are different kinds of solar power, and there are advances happening in that all the time.
Oh, yeah,
it's wonderful if you want to power a space station.
Yeah.
If you want to have a street light or a parking meter that runs off its own power source, like it can work quite well for that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But as a mass source of power
it's just not reliable enough. Solar panels typically work about 27% of the time.
Right.
Which is sad.
And that would depend on the sunlight level if you're in this country where it's cloudy a lot of the time versus if you're in California, you might get more.
Right. And that's, on average, including all of those extremes that you're talking about. But there's also the fact of the commercially available ones only use about 20% of the sunlight that they get. And the best that they've developed that aren't on the market yet are only getting 40%. There's one that I've read about, which is actually kind of cool. It's I'll insert my advancement here. So somebody has developed a type of solar panel that's basically a colorful film that goes on your window, made from crop residues. They actually are able to function about 50% of the time, even when it's cloudy. The system is called Aureus, Aureus. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Aureus, maybe?
Maybe, I don't know. But they look really pretty. They look like plastic version of stained glass windows, basically, and they are able to work. I think this person was in the UK who developed this, and so they're able to work even in the cloudy UK.
Yeah. It's not cloudy all the time, but we certainly get fewer hours of sunshine than southern France or California or somewhere like that.
Yeah, so advances like that are improving it, but most of the solar panels that are available, that are commercially available, are too expensive to be worth it, and the advances are happening so quickly, which is a positive, but the advances are happening so quickly that it's like, well, why would I buy one now, like for your home or your business, when you could wait 5 years and the technology is going to be 10 times better?
Yeah.
Because right now in the UK, for an average homeowner to buy solar panels for their house, you're looking at £4,000 to £6,000.
Yeah.
Which is just silly for most people.
That gets distorted because government subsidize it, so for the end consumer sometimes it seems like you're getting a really good deal, but then somebody else is paying for that,
right?
But
but going back to your theme of reliability, we've got probably the least reliable are solar and wind, and I had figures, I don't think I brought them with me, but for percentage of what percentage of the time different energy plants actually function. And solar and wind were down in like the 20 and 30%. I think solar was 27.
Yeah, I'd separate the two figures you gave there before, which was the percentage of time that they're reliable from the percentage of potential energy that you get, because every power source, no power source gets you 100% of the energy.
No.
Like when you drive your car around, you're getting like 10 to 20% of the energy that's in the fuel.
Right.
Like, firstly, you're always going to lose stuff through heat and other sources, and then it's just we don't have 100%.
Well, and you have to put energy in to get energy out, so it's that's part of the issue, the challenge with nuclear.
But the issue with solar is that there's days and same with wind. There's just periods when they won't work, and if you are going to use that as part of your mix, and again, it's fine if you have a canal boat and it's away, or something. But if you're going to use it as part of a mix for a large scale generation that cities are relying on, and hospitals are relying on, and people's houses are relying on, businesses are relying on, then you're going to need that backup capability, and that can't be gas stations that we don't have enough gas to fuel, or you can't just cut out, like the British government has been doing with coal-fired power stations, just shutting them down when there's not a suitable replacement, or like Germany is doing with nuclear, which is even crazier, shutting down nuclear plants. You're just cutting out your ability to sustain when the other modes aren't delivering. Yeah,
and the solution I've heard proposed for solar and wind's unreliability is batteries, but to actually, well, first of all, most of these solar panels and wind turbines aren't producing enough to be worth storing in batteries for long term. But even if you could get them to the point where they were, the amount of space you would need, never mind the materials you would need for those batteries, makes it, at the moment anyway, completely not cost efficient. Never mind the whole ethical issues with certain elements that you need for like cobalt batteries that are often mined in developing countries. Usually quite unethically using child labor.
Well, like I was saying on the Hero Show, talking about Elon Musk and Tesla the other day, is that also you have to dispose of those batteries at some point. Capacitors are a more interesting solution for that. That's a great area of research to investigate, but it's not there at the moment.
No.
But yeah, that's not any better really. But I think the one thing that is better is nuclear power.
Nuclear has a lot going for it.
Yeah. And but it has this public perception of being unsafe.
Yeah, and I think there are a few reasons for that, which I think are worth discussing. One of the reasons that I think that nuclear came into the sort of public's awareness through war, and so people connect it in their heads with war and destruction.
Yeah.
Then a couple of highly publicized.
Literally two.
Literally two. Yeah. Okay, two. Actually, two highly publicized disasters is maybe too strong of a word for the second one, but you had Chernobyl and you had Fukushima.
Well, yeah, Fukushima was a disaster in the tidal wave hitting was a disaster.
Right.
So Fukushima happened in the middle of a disaster, and I want to talk a little about that. Okay. Chernobyl, you want to take that first?
So Chernobyl was a result of a number of design problems, and it was under the Soviet system, so it was a combination of accountability issues and design issues, and a test being run that shouldn't have been, and design problems that could easily have been solved. For a really excellent dramatization of it, see the show Chernobyl. We'll link to a review from The Objective Standard on that show in the show notes. It's not for the faint of heart. I got really nauseous watching it, but it does a really good job of showing what the actual problems were, both technically and regarding the social system surrounding it. Yeah. But the point is, design solutions are a huge part of making nuclear safe. And so some of the advancements that I've been hearing about and reading about in nuclear are things like they call them passive safety measures that you can build into nuclear, that things that are shielding the radiation, things that are, for example, valves that will melt at a certain temperature so that reactions stop. The point is there are solutions. We just have to find them and apply them.
That was actually my innovation. I mean, that's fine. It's just you kind of led on to what I was going to talk about. So I was going to talk initially about Fukushima itself. Go on. Which is, apart from the sort of obvious takeaway of don't build power plants where tidal waves might hit, but that's can come across as a little facetious. The more important point to note there is that it was really the disaster, the storm, that caused deaths and destruction in that rather than the power plant. What happened is that when the power plant was hit by the tidal wave and lost containment, there was a rapid evacuation to get people out of all the affected areas before radiation poisoning could really kick in. So that mass evacuation was basically a stampede in appalling conditions, and there were 573 deaths in that evacuation process. Those weren't caused by radiation, by nuclear power or anything like that. They were caused by the evacuation process. There's been one death directly linked to the plant itself. There will probably be more because those are cancer victims as a result of radiation poisoning.
Sure.
Because unfortunately the thing with I think another reason that people find nuclear power scary is that gamma rays travel at the speed of light. So if you've seen it, you've been hit by it. There's no escaping that once it's out. And that's understandably terrifying, but so for the people who were caught inside that range, but the thing is, it didn't, it wasn't the leaking that caused all those deaths. So and then the figures with Chernobyl are disputed as well in terms of how many of the deaths there were caused by the plant or not. The thing is that there are innovations happening now that rendered that whole discussion
completely
irrelevant. Anyway,
it's all moot.
So third generation reactors, which Fukushima wasn't. I think Fukushima was the second generation reactor. As you say, have passive safety features like water cooling that can passively cool if it doesn't go critical. If it's lost and there's nobody there to attend it, it will naturally cool down. It will
stop.
Time. And that's generation 3, which there are now plants being built like that. There's generation 4 in planning after that, which has really, really cool properties like the ability to make fuels out of the waste product that the plant produces, carbon neutral fuels that you can burn in traditional power plants from the nuclear waste.
Oh, cool. That's really useful.
So that deals with the radioactive waste problem to some extent, which is the other thing that's thrown at nuclear is you get this radioactive byproduct.
Which is true, but there are ways to prevent that from, if you cover it in concrete and bury it, it's not going to bother anyone, and it's such a small amount compared to the power produced that it's a relatively small issue. It is an issue, but it's a relatively small one.
I mean, you can do what the Finnish are doing, which is bury it in a giant underground cave system, which they've built that has enough space to do that for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
You can launch it into orbit. You can do, well, not orbit probably, but launch it into the sun. There's all sorts of things you can do with that. But also, if we can get nuclear fusion going, which there's been so many, we can't even pick them up on this show. There's been so many steps forward in fusion in just the last few months that will produce radioactive material with a much shorter half-life that becomes basically safe over a much shorter period of time versus uranium and plutonium with their multi-billion year half-lives that are basically always radioactive.
Right.
But radiation is everywhere. Like we see it as this scary thing. I think movies in the 50s didn't help, during the height of the Cold War, and everyone saw radiation as this scary thing that mutates you. But we're bathed in it all the time. There's radiation in the soil, there's radiation in our bodies, it's transmissions and things like that as well. That's coming in from space all the time.
Yeah. So
it's just a question of levels and types.
Yeah, if I could jump in with 2 points. One is an advancement on the theme you were talking about, and then challenges for nuclear. So one other advancement is funded by Bill Gates, a company he co-founded called TerraPower. And to improve the cooling, they are not using water, which is actually as we talked about in our water episode, is actually a pretty effective coolant. They're using molten salt.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sodium chloride in liquid form. In
liquid form, yes. And the advantage of that, besides the fact that it's really effective, is they actually can store the heat effectively in the salt until they need it and can use it for something else. So we're making it more efficient by taking care of that extra heat that's being produced.
It's got that thermal capacity that you're talking about with water.
Yes, but higher. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's a really cool effort funded by Bill Gates there.
Yeah.
And then, so just to wrap up, I think, our bit on nuclear, and returning to your theme of radiation, there are a number of regulatory barriers in most countries, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from the stigmas we've been talking about. Laws and policies, especially in a democratic country, tend to follow the culture.
Essentially free country.
Well, I wasn't going for free, I was going for representative government, but the case may be. So you have this massive, really complicated system in the US in particular. It typically takes years and years to get a design approved, and then you have to get a permit to build, and then you have to get a permit to operate. And all of these things take tens of thousands, actually usually millions of dollars, and years and years. I think I was hearing about one case that took them 3.5 years just to get their design approved.
It creates a wall that any project has to get over that's stopping God knows what from happening.
And it's not just, you have to tick boxes. First of all, the regulators have bad incentives because they're being paid per hour, and they're being... so there's that. And then if anything goes wrong, they're the ones who get blamed, right? Yeah. And number two...
Sounds like Chernobyl, doesn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In terms of radiation, the standard in the US is not... We should keep radiation to a level where it's not immediately harmful to human health, or not, harmful to human health. The standard is as low as is reasonably possible. And as the technology gets better, that means, now you have to have cutting edge technology because it's possible to get there. These people are doing it, so now you have to too. Yeah. So the goalpost keeps moving beyond the level of let's not harm human health.
Yeah, it's like relative poverty, isn't it? It's like the richer the country gets, the richer your definition of poor gets.
Exactly. Wait, what?
The problem can't ever be solved.
No, because the goalpost keeps moving, exactly. So I think that's all I really wanted to talk about on nuclear, unless there's... No, that's all I think.
I was just going to talk briefly about pocket reactors.
The little ones. Yeah, go for it.
And also, just pick up on your last point about government getting in the way, is that, in a sense, I want to congratulate the British government because they are going with nuclear power when other countries aren't. And we've got one under construction, one about to start large-scale nuclear power stations. And then there's also some government funding going into these pocket reactors, which are being developed by companies, but the government's sort of trying to accelerate their development, which are a really great idea. They're these just small scale, they can just power one business, and they're easily disposed of at the end. They're self-contained. They have the passive safety built in, and that's a really exciting development. The issue with the government involvement is particularly with the larger power stations, is that they mismanage the whole process. And the new one in I've forgotten what it's called now. The one that they're building in South Wales, I think it is 3 times more expensive than it needs to be. And there's these government contracts being handed out to companies 10 years ago when this project started being developed that are no longer relevant. The technology is out of date. Yeah. The costs are inflated because of the bidding process that went on. They're locked into these contracts with EDF Energy and companies like that. They're sort of basically being extorted. It's the same thing you see with every large-scale government project. The costs overrun and overrun and overrun. And then by the time it's finished, you get a thing that's no longer relevant. Mm-hmm. And if it was just deregulated more and companies were encouraged to build what they want to build, then you could probably get a much better product for a lower cost. But as it is, I'm glad we're getting more nuclear power in this country. It's a little too little and too slow, mm-hmm. but I'm glad that's happening. But what we're getting is a long way off state of the art. Yeah. At least on the large scale. The smaller ones are more exciting. But as I say, that's a private initiative that the government's kind of riding on the back of. Mm. And how much that government money will actually help and how much it won't, and what strings it comes attached with is another question.
Sure.
But pocket reactors are a really encouraging idea. These plug-in and play boxes that...
Yeah, it's basically just, they set them up. They run for 10, 15 years, and then you just have to refuel them and take out the waste, and they can run for another 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
So if you've covered everything you wanted to on nuclear...
I think so.
Okay, then I want to jump into hydropower, because there are some interesting parallels that I wanted to talk about.
Yes, and there's a couple points I want to make on hydroelectric as well.
Yeah, totally. So, for the record, we're going to use hydropower and hydroelectric power interchangeably because I think they're the same thing, and I've seen it used interchangeably in multiple articles on the topic. So, same thing. Don't be confused. But hydropower is actually way more promising than I realized, and there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that, hydropower, in case you guys aren't aware, is just that when you run, you basically dam a river, and it turns the turbine that would be needed to create electricity just with the flow of the river.
Yeah, it's really any use of flowing water.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a river.
Going right back to water mills on rivers, mm-hmm. It is a form of hydropower.
Hydropower, yeah.
Hydroelectric is more specifically using it to generate electricity rather than just run a machine. But it's a different thing from tidal power, which we can talk about briefly. But
quite related, yeah. So hydroelectric power, one of the cool things about hydroelectric plants is that they have extremely long lifespans. They're typically built to last 50 to 100 years. So that's actually, from what I could find, the longest lasting of any of the power plants that we currently know how to build is that 50 to 100 year time range for hydropower. And then one of the advancements in hydropower, which I don't seem to have written down. Shoot, I wanted to give credit where it was due. But anyway, to the people who are doing it, but my bad. Because one of the problems that you get with this is it can disturb the river's ecology mm-hmm. or whatever your water source is, which is especially a problem, obviously, for fishing communities, but that are downstream from that. But some people have developed smaller hydropower that just kind of sit in the stream, so or the river. So they don't disturb as much of the flora and fauna, the ecosystem of the river, and B, you can use it in smaller water sources. You can even use it, they were saying, in like sewers in cities. So that would expand how much people could use hydropower, like how much you could produce and how many people could use it. So in both senses of how much, and cause less disruption in the process. And I'm sorry, I don't seem to have who did it, but it's being done.
We can put it in the description.
Yes.
Yeah. But no, your point about the ecology is, that's the impact that hydroelectric dams can have is, I don't think there's anything wrong with necessarily, creating a new lake. Like sits behind the Hoover Dam necessarily, but what we've been seeing in China is a whole other level. The environmentalists are up in arms about the damming of the Yangtze and the effect that's having on wildlife, but also it's having an enormous human toll. Yeah. Villages are being flooded in China. People are just told to get out. Your villages are going to be here this time next year, and then also the Chinese are damming rivers that then flow into other countries. So places like Cambodia.
So this is
struggling poor countries are having their water source dried up because the Chinese are damming the river further up.
So this is a very clear-cut example of when power generation is a rights violation.
Yeah. I mean, that's a massive rights violation.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they're literally just denying Cambodians access to natural resources.
Yeah, entirely countries and communities, yeah.
And so, yeah, that's pretty concerning. But, and yeah, it's hardly surprising coming from a rights violating regime like China. I don't want to, when I say the Chinese, obviously Chinese people.
We mean the Chinese Communist Party, not...
They are victims of that government.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, it's what the Chinese government is doing. But no, so that's the caveat with hydroelectric. But the principle of sticking a wheel in a river and getting power from that is a really good one, and it's quite a promising and successful solution. Tidal energy is a bit more complicated because there's different kinds of that. There's using the rhythm of great waves to turn wheels, and there's using the up-down motion of
which I think we've covered on this show before. One of the tests of the up-down motion, getting that to a point where it's actually viable. But
there is a lot of energy just kicking around in nature that you might as well tap into.
Yeah.
So it certainly has. I mean, there's always the risk of some environmental impact with any of these things. As I say, wind turbines hit birds out of the air sometimes, and fish can get caught in these things. But to what extent is this drive to reduce impact going to get us to a point where we can't drive human life anymore?
Another quick advancement insert there for the wind blade turbine problem, because it is a serious problem. Turbines are hitting lots of birds and bats and causing problems there. But there's a company called Vortex Bladeless out of Spain that is making bladeless wind turbines.
How's that work?
It sways.
Oh, okay.
And the idea is you can put them in cities, they don't have to be, because one of the problems with wind is that they have to be out way in the middle of nowhere, or out in the ocean, and then you have to move that power back rather than having it in a city where it's being used. So the idea is you can have it in a city, it's not going to cause so many problems for wildlife, and also it's actually a serious problem with wind turbines. Those giant blades, they're huge.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how big they are, and one of the ways to make them more efficient is to make them bigger, but then what do you do with them? They only have a lifespan of like 10 years.
Yeah. Like building the things is so expensive, especially if you're doing it in the ocean.
Yeah.
And then trucking these enormous blades into position is a huge undertaking.
And then when they're done, what do you do with them?
Yeah.
And so there are some creative solutions on that, in using them in civil engineering projects and actually just recycling the material. But if you didn't have to do that, it would be so much better. And so Vortex Bladeless is one of the companies trying to solve that problem.
Yeah, I'm anecdotally skeptical. I hope that they succeed in doing that, because they were trying about 10 years ago these twisting circular kind of turbines that spin vertically, so that they're not turning. Well, they're not turning through a vertical axis. They're turning through a horizontal axis. So they point upwards and turn, and they're sort of three blades that twist around each other. I hope that Vortex succeeds in what they're doing, but I'm anecdotally skeptical because of these turbines that we see sometimes in the UK that were pioneered about 10-12 years ago, which have the vertical twisting blades and they spin on a horizontal axis. And for about a year or two, you saw them spinning a lot, and now you just see them sitting there, never turning.
Ooh.
And there's a lot of these innovations, like there's the Shada in London, this skyscraper with 3 turbines that's built into the roof, and they haven't turned in years. And I just worry that we're going to get a lot of these expensive installations that never
don't work. Yeah.
So hopefully they're more successful.
Yeah, I don't know about the cost of these, but
yeah.
Any other thoughts on wind power? Shall we move on to one of the last things I wanted to cover?
No, just the sort of general overriding theme, really, of just how much the power generation over the last 200 years has enhanced human flourishing to get us to a point where we can even have this sort of conversation.
That's true.
And even have this technology to do this stuff with and worry about these sorts of issues.
Absolutely.
When we're not just living in poverty because electricity doesn't exist. So it's just really important to remember, why power is a good thing, why we shouldn't be stressing too much about environmental impact when human quality of life would be so appalling if we didn't have what we have. But it's also awesome that we're progressing technology in a way that we can do that more and more efficiently, like we were saying earlier.
Totally, yeah. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is just geothermal power, which is in a place right now where it's providing some power and heat in some places. So geothermal power is basically just using the fact that under the Earth's surface, it's very hot, right? Most of us remember that from basic geology, I hope. And if you can get to the places where it's hot, which actually does vary depending on where you are on the Earth, you can use that either directly or you can use it to, you can inject water and it creates steam that turns a turbine and that creates electricity. So one place they're using it a lot right now is Iceland, where they have a lot of like volcanoes and things. So they have that.
They're on a plate boundary. So,
right, they're on a plate boundary. So they have that stuff kind of close to the surface, so it's easier for them. And so Iceland actually gets about 90% of its heat from geothermal directly. Like they just pipe that up through people's houses and that's how they stay warm. In Iceland, where you really need to stay warm part of the year.
Yeah, it's called that for a reason. Or isn't the joke that Iceland's green and Greenland's covered in ice?
Right, but there are penguins, but
penguins in Iceland? The penguins live on the South Pole.
Oh no, it's not penguins. What are those little birds? It doesn't matter.
They're great. A couple of hundred years ago, there were great auks, which were kind of a penguin in Iceland, but not these days.
But they're little birds. What are they called? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But people are experimenting with some different ways to make it more accessible and more cost-effective in other parts of the world. Because the thing is, right now, with the technology that was developed for drilling for oil and natural gas, you can drill and use geothermal, but it's expensive and you risk a lot of disruption.
Yeah.
So there are basically 3 solutions that I've found. One is a company called Fervo Energy has used fiber optic sensing to increase the productivity and the lifetime of the wells. So they're able to figure out exactly how to drill and where to pump things so that it can be more efficient and work for longer, basically, in the same spot that they've drilled in.
Right.
So that's one way to go about it. But other people are experimenting with either drilling really, really deep, where the temperatures are really high, so
Which pushes up the cost both of drilling and of building heat-resistant materials.
It does, but you get more energy out of it.
Yeah.
Because the temperatures are like, if you go down far enough, they're 3 to 4 times where most people are drilling. So the other way you can do geothermal drilling is the opposite of going super, super deep. You go really slow, shallowly. And so with that, it's much cheaper and you don't have as much disruption of everything. Yeah. But you don't get quite as much power. So it's the trade-off there. But it is still a potential solution, especially in areas where you do have high temperatures relatively close to the surface.
Right.
So I think that's all I had that I wanted to cover on advancements.
Yeah, no, I think I've restated the main points I wanted to make are, just the wonderful benefit that electrical power brings to human life. So, and the fact it enables everything we've spoken about on this episode and on all of the others. And I suppose the other thing is just that, often I think trying to have a which source is best conversation really depends on what your purpose is. But if your purpose is powering an entire country, really just let it naturally happen in terms of what's gonna, what people are gonna want for different things. But a mix is always going to be the result. Unless you're Norway where you've got rivers everywhere, or you're Iceland where you've got volcanoes everywhere. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the geography of a country gives them a natural advantage.
But otherwise, you're probably going to find a mixture of nuclear should be like backbone, I think, but there's going to be a number of other sources that are...
At the moment, there could be other ways in the future that we don't even know about now. But
0 point energy and all sorts of cool things like that might come along in the next 50, 100 years. But in the meantime, I think nuclear is obviously the thing for running whole cities off of, but for businesses and things, there's all sorts of different solutions that work better or worse for different people. Yeah,
in different situations. You just have to be sure you're not violating people's rights in the process at China.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Innovation Celebration, for reflecting on ways in which power is generated and how those power human flourishing, and some of the pros and cons and advancements in that area.
Thank you very much.